right. So the first thing we should really say about the Sanders campaign is how great the excitement around it is. It's really energized a group of diverse leftists and newly radicalizing people, and it's gotten folks engaged. As opposed to Hillary, he's talking about corporate influence in politics, class inequality, stuff like that. It's really nice. That said, I think he's making a mistake running inside the Democratic Party. This is a party that's historically shown itself as being incapable of being transformed from the left from inside. Today I'm going to talk a bit about the historical pattern that we can see of the Democratic Party undercutting effective social movements and really hamstringing them. First we're going to look at labor movements, and then with regards to peace and anti-war movements, and then finally with the civil rights movements throughout the last century, which is a sort of a specialty of the Democratic Party. So let's start with the New Deal, since that's really when the tactic of trying to pull the Democrats to the left from within got traction. It's important to have a bit of background here to contextualize FDR's social programs. In the years previous to FDR's election, the labor movement had been gaining serious traction. Strikes and unionization were on the rise, and so was class consciousness. The massive failure of Hoover to address the Depression left a full 25% of all people in the U.S. unemployed. That's 15 million people without jobs. Many homeless, many unable to afford food. Shantytowns had begun to be constructed all over the U.S., known as Hoovervilles. And in these communities, there was organization and activity. Unemployment councils began to spring up all over, with hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets of New York, Detroit, Washington, San Francisco, and other cities in mass protests. This was alongside starving mobs taking food from trucks carrying baked goods, marches on stores to demand food from the storekeepers, and eviction resistance that was really quite effective, that prevented people from becoming, homelessness from becoming even more of a problem. Now, it's important to note that these unemployment councils embraced diversity of race and gender, which was a part of their successful growth and their successful gains. So at the same time as this was happening, major municipalities in the U.S., almost all of them, began to go bankrupt. They also began demanding relief from the government alongside this unemployed labor movement. By June of 1932, the mayor of Chicago told a House committee in the federal government that if the federal government didn't send $150 million for relief immediately, they'd have to send troops later. These local disturbances began to spill over into national politics. Workers began voting for the Democratic Party en masse because the Republicans were the incumbents. At first, this was a visceral reaction, just voting the bums out, essentially, and soon it became entrenched. So this was alongside a series of strikes by the employed, culminating in a very electrified political atmosphere when FDR was inaugurated. So as he was inaugurated, he immediately proposed and Congress passed measures to address the level of unemployment, the fulfillment of campaign promises that he had made to get elected. He passed the NRA, which gave workers the right to unionize, but it also gave businesses the right to fix prices. The New Deal established the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which put men to work in the national forest. It provided work for 2.5 million people over the next 10 years. But women were barred from work in the CCC because construction wasn't considered appropriate women's work. Quotas limited black men to just 10% of the jobs, and they were forced into housing that was segregated by camps. Eligibility for job programs created by the New Deal were similarly segregated, as historian Nancy Rose points out. She says, in general, the eligibility test was applied most leniently in the large northern cities where the protests were more widespread, as the high levels of unemployment led people to understand that joblessness was not caused by personal failure, but by factors beyond the control of individuals. It was applied most stringently in the rural areas of the South, where the white elites continued to fight attempts to provide relief, especially to African Americans, because it also provided an alternative to ultra-low wage labor. So, all this was accompanied by a very strong push by the party structure to move the unemployed away from tactics that would disrupt society, the very tactics that had been so successful in their previous gains in the first place. The unemployment councils were barred from entering the relief centers that these programs took place in, and the leadership pushed the ideology of lesser evilism to former members of the movement. If you don't work with us, you'll have to work against the Republicans. This was a long-slide legislative effort to remove the relief programs available and replace them with programs that provided manual labor jobs for just above poverty wages. In 1934, FDR said, "Continued dependence upon relief induces a spiritual disintegration fundamentally destructive to the national fiber," to give you an idea of how that policy was justified when straits were so dire. The demobilization of the unemployed movement gave control to the upper echelon of the Democratic Party, the wealthy elites. Unions like the UAW, the CIO, and others considered splitting with the Democrats to create their own labor party because of this, specifically set up to represent the interests of the working class. Several unions actually voted not to support FDR or the Democrats, but were then blackmailed by John Lewis, an AFL bureaucrat, to fall back into line. Sidney Hillman, another AFL bureaucrat, said, quote, "I say to you that the defeat of Roosevelt and the introduction of a real fascist movement is going to make the work of building a real labor movement impossible," echoing the line that we hear to this very day. In the decades that followed, many strikes and labor actions would be put down, often violently, by the state, often under a Democrat. So, similarly to the labor movement, Democrats have a history of absorbing and undercutting anti-war movements. Lyndon B. Johnson ran in 1964 under a platform of peace. During his campaign, he stated with regards to Vietnam, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." This was while he was escalating conflict in Vietnam. His Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater, was thought of by many as a warmonger. He referred to the USSR as the enemy. Many suspected that he would use nuclear arms against the Soviet Union, so LBJ easily fell into the peace candidate motif. But despite that campaign, he escalated the war. He requested that he be allowed to increase U.S. military presence before the election was even finished in 1964. The U.S. military supported ongoing South Vietnamese raids in the countryside. It implemented a U.S. program of bombing the Lao border to disrupt supply lines. It backed South Vietnamese raids on the North Vietnamese coast, and it stationed 2 destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was all followed by another U.S. bombing campaign and then the deployment of troops in 1967. So the next year after that, there's a huge amount of disappointment with LBJ for escalating the war. And then begins the pattern of Democrats using primaries to rally a movement and then refocus it on electing someone who does not share their values. George McGovern was a figure in opposition to the Vietnam War, and when it was clear that he wouldn't win the 1968 primary, he backed Humphrey, disillusioning many in the anti-war movement because he didn't get any concessions from Humphrey. Similarly, Obama ran on a platform of peace, closing Guantanamo, ending the war in Iraq, and various vague suggestions about easing U.S. intervention and imperialism. Compare this to his actual record: an escalation in Afghanistan, Guantanamo open, 4,000 troops still in Iraq, increased military presence in Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and a drone campaign known worldwide for its massive civilian casualties. One could talk about other issues he co-opted as well, not the least of which is immigration reform that he promised while overseeing record deportations, but we have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to move on to the civil rights movement and their relationship with the Democratic Party. So as I mentioned earlier, many New Deal programs came with a racial stipulation. The money injected into the economy through the working class was mostly limited to the white working class, creating an artificial layer of wealthy workers, what we now call the middle class, that were almost entirely white men, white heterosexual men. Black industrial workers who fought for labor rights in the 30s often referred to the NRA as the Negro Removal Act because it allowed businesses to exclude racial minorities from minimum wage laws, safety laws, and other provisions. So this began to shift when Truman in 1948 began to court the black vote, just as the NAACP won several legal battles that theoretically allowed black people to vote in the South. In practice, it was a lot more violent than that, but So by 1954, when segregation was struck down, conditions became ripe for protest. The Montgomery bus boycott, inspired by Rosa Parks, was among the first and brought to prominence activists like Martin Luther King Jr. Virtually every former Confederate state enacted legislative policies to prevent this desegregation, including closing and padlocking schools rather than opening them to people of color. During this period, we see strange and sometimes drastic shifts in both parties in order to simultaneously court the Southern racist vote and the Northern black leftist vote. Lyndon B. Johnson, for instance, was consistent during his time in the House. He voted down every single piece of legislation that challenged segregation, 100%, and repeatedly voted for legislation that further entrenched it. In 1956, though, for the first time since the New Deal, a Republican, Eisenhower, had the majority of the black vote. Because of that, LBJ began shifting his policies accordingly, proposing a Civil Rights Act in 1957 that was gutted to appeal the Dixiecrat base. So it was actually the Civil Rights Movement, the mass movement in 1960, that changed the political landscape. Sit-ins and other forms of protest began spreading like wildfire. The Southern Christian Leadership Council had formed in the wake of the successful Montgomery boycott, and they focused on civil disobedience to obtain the right to vote. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was also formed, and it had a much more broad purview, going on to help found the Black Power movement. Eisenhower and Nixon, during the 1960 election, decided not to address this growing movement or the fact that Martin Luther King was arrested. And so Kennedy saw an opportunity and took it by calling Coretta Scott King while her husband was in prison and calling for his release. The Democrats then distributed 2 million copies of brochures condemning Republican inaction and exalting Kennedy's actions in ghetto areas. Kennedy received 82% of the black vote in 1960 consequently. So far from acting on these overtures that he made to get that vote, Kennedy promptly stalled on action after his election. Instead, he appointed 3 overtly racist white supremacists to the Supreme Court. Because his rhetoric was strong in the area and his action was so totally lacking, both the Southern racists and the civil rights movements were dissatisfied and began to escalate their tactics, specifically the freedom rides and the brutal responses to the freedom rides. These tactics gave the movement national attention and brought the cruelty and inhumanity of white supremacy to the forefront, and Kennedy couldn't ignore it anymore. His solutions, however, were focused on removing the threat to the status quo that was represented by the civil rights movement, specifically by funneling all activity into limited reforms that only address voting rights. He told the representatives of the student groups, if you cut out this freedom rider and sitting in stuff and concentrate on voter registration, I'll get you a tax exemption. Southern states responded to this with unrelenting violence. In the words of one of Kennedy's assistants, yet a year afterwards, there were multiple beatings, multiple murders and arrests, but no new black voters in the South. So despite the extreme documentation of violence against activists, no action was taken by the Kennedy administration to support the focus on voting rights instead of mass demonstration that he had advocated, leaving the activists to face the violence without federal support. So during the campaign for the Civil Rights Act, over 20 churches were bombed and Kennedy was assassinated. After the Battle of Birmingham, LBJ called for the Civil Rights Act passing, and despite a 54-day filibuster from Southern forces, swiftly followed it with the Voting Rights Act a year later. In the wake of this, the movement that had focused around voting rights ebbed in the South, and in the North refocused on economic issues. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Democrats entrenched themselves as the party for black people in the South. Part of the movement went from the streets to party building for the Democrats, and the incentives of public office were very compelling to the conservative wing of the movement, leading them to turn away from protests and in many cases even to denounce it. The group was further entrenched by the Great Society and War on Poverty programs enacted by LBJ. So this left the left wing of the movement with a question. What did voting rights matter if there aren't jobs available for black people, and if wages are so low as to keep workers impoverished? This problem was underscored and exemplified by a series of riots in 1966 and 67, and the Black Panther Party was formed as a response to address issues in these communities and provide relief. Again, like in the 1930s, a movement formed and was making amazing gains when LBJ responded with the Great Society and War on Poverty programs. These measures were focused on creating a moderate layer of working class black people, a black middle class, to pose an alternative to the leftist programs of the Panthers and others like them. About a decade later, Jesse Jackson would try to steer the party from the left to the left from within. Like McGovern before him, Jackson acted as a magnet for Democratic voters with his National Rainbow Coalition campaigns in 1984 and 88. In 84, he won a full 21% of the Democratic vote, but the party rules restricted him to only 11% of the delegates. He ended up endorsing Walter Mondale without any concessions to his platform. Mondale dismissed the coalition out of hand, but still received their support. The same was true of Dukakis in 1988. In the words of Jackson, "We have too much invested in the Democratic Party. When you have money in the bank, you don't walk away from it." Another attempt to pull the Democrats internally left failed by co-optation. So clearly this isn't a holistic look at the Democratic Party's history by any means. That said, the pattern repeats itself again and again historically. Movement begins to emerge in response to irreconcilable conflicts, and it gains traction. As it gains traction, the Democratic Party will offer mild concessions, not to support the movement, but to use it as political leverage. Occasionally, a candidate with radical ideals will show up in the Democratic primary, only to shepherd leftists back into the quagmire of elitist politics. So with that in mind, we should be ready for the inevitable subversion of the ruling class to appear, and have a plan to better address it than leftists have in the past. We could discuss examples of this all day, but I've got to wrap up because Max is going to talk about how we relate to this in contemporary politics. Then Andrea will talk about the nomination process and the Plan B that the Green Party represents. Thank you.